Before beginning, I want to emphasize a point which I think is particularly important for scholars of art history and history interested in the early Slavic world construed broadly. I'm showing you on the screen a tracing from the collection of the Russian History Museum in Jordanville on the left, and an icon from the collection of the Icon Museum and Study Center in Clinton. They both represent imagery which became popular in Old Believer circles, a sect of the Russian Orthodox Church stemming from divisions in the 17th century. Shows God the Father reclined on a sort of bed after the 6 days of creation. And I don't want to talk in particular about, in detail about this imagery, but I want to use it as an example to sort of emphasize how much interconnectedness there is between archives and museums in the United States, which is only really starting to be taken fully advantage of and recognized by scholars and individuals working in instruction in Russian language or Slavic languages broadly. It's a fantastic example, and this particular example I got to see when we were planning the show that Anastasia mentioned in the introduction on printed icons. So today I want to talk about icon painting in Muscovy, and in particular to focus on the impact of a skilled way of painting on viewers in the 16th century. When an individual looked at an icon, what were the cues that signaled that this was a work of a proficient painter? To take a specific example, what about this crucifixion painted by Dionisi from the early 16th century, late 15th century, which once hung on the iconostasis at Pafnutiev-Borovsky Monastery in northern Russia? Looking at the icon, what aspects of it called attention not just to the sacred event of the crucifixion, or even its relation to other icons which would have stood alongside it on the iconostasis, but rather to the hand of the maker and signaling that hand's aptitude or skill. The reason I think this line of questioning is important is that when dealing with icons, it's easy to forget that the maker was never far from mind. While we're accustomed to think of works in other media like canvas painting and the old masters or sculpture from classical Greece as being associated with a workshop, medieval art and especially icons are often shrouded in anonymity, as if the individual behind the painter, behind the panel actually didn't really matter that much. And yet, in fact, we know a great deal about icon painters in both Muscovy and in Byzantium, as well as in the Veneto-Cretan world, to name just one other post-Byzantine tradition. And equally important, when we don't know their names, there were moves that icon painters could make to pull themselves forward in the viewing experience. And there were anecdotes in hagiography, which were read during the liturgy, as well as in epistles and in chronicles. And many of them emphasized the immense challenges that icon painters faced when designing an image. This was not, in other words, a facile art form. Painters, said differently then, could foreground their work or labor, and they could make themselves present in the image's embodiment, a spiritual ideal, and turn the viewer's attention on themselves. What I want to do is to extend these reflections about the presencing of a maker to a set of feast icons at the Icon Museum and Study Center. And in particular, I want to focus on two aspects of their execution and design, and that is the style and the model, which are alluded to in the title of my talk. Before dealing with the works themselves, it's important to clarify the key terms at play here. Because in a way, what I want to do is not talk about our understanding of style and model, but to try as much as possible to recover a historical, that is, a medieval East Slavic, rather than a modern ahistorical definition of these terms. So to return to the types of questions with which I began, what would a Muscovite viewer have experienced as style and model when confronted with a set of these icons? What were the ways that their visual rhetoric, as it were, was perceived and therefore appreciated? On the one hand, Muscovite authors were inheritors of a classical tradition, just as the Serbs and the Bulgarians and the Moldavians were, and so forth. But there were key differences at play in their perceptual schemes or frameworks in places like Pskov, which I'll talk about further, as compared to the Mediterranean world. This was a world that was very far away culturally and also politically and economically. Although at the same time, Muscovite authors and painters continually tried to draw the Mediterranean world closer in their visual legacy. Moreover, in Muscovy, there was little to speak of by way of a secular education. So there's nothing that fully approaches the generality of the progymnasium for grammar and rhetoric. And this has repercussions for the ways that authors described and therefore viewers understood and perceived imagery. So just to give one example, there aren't any full-fledged Muscovite ekphrases of icons. So the around style and model was of a rather different sort. The word for marks of paint, or pismo, was used to translate the Greek word graphe. And like that term, pismo was also applied both to painting and to writing. In sources from the period, such as inventories, letters, chronicles, inscriptions, court cases, and so forth, pismo occurs in the phrase masterskoye pismo, which can be translated as a workshop style or a way of painting, or a master style or way of painting. And maistor is itself a Greek term. While authors rarely spelled out their meaning, we do gain a sense of what contributed to a sense of an individual style or school from the objects themselves, which is really where my emphasis lies in the first half of this talk. They ranged from a painter's idiosyncratic understanding of form or unconventional treatment of a model and expressive use of color to things like their speedy brush or bold displays of confidence as they left behind an underdraw or just completely eschewed it at all. These effects were registered by the language of hitrost, which denoted the ingenuity or staged artificiality of a painter's presentation of form. A hitri painter was a clever master who performed technical feats. The hitri was to belong to an elite circle of the most revered painters in Muscovy. The hitri painter controlled appearances, and this language is akin to the sort of duplicity that you also have in the Greek language around techne, because one who is technically proficient controls appearances, and that also can lead to things like deception or even sort of a type of ruse. And they thought about it in the same way as a doctor who has the knowledge of healing could also, if he's not trained properly, poison or lead astray or forestall recovery. On the other hand, the language of models appears in numerous records. The term is obrazец, which comes from the root word obraz, or image or icon, and it denotes a template or a pattern which has been extracted from a concrete iteration of an image. Obrazец can translate the Greek term typos, which means a type or a genus or even an imprint, and hence the English word typography, or printed letters and lines. Not surprisingly, obrazец would come to denote the monotype tracings or prorisi and perivodi, which were printed from icons that masters and apprentices had copied. And I'm showing you one example here of the Mother of God of Kazan from the Russian histories. Now, taking these two terms together, pismo and образец, we can say that the Muscovites would have thought about style or the way of handling an image as the individualization or singular version of a model, which was conceived as the abstracted genus, the image type. So said differently, style was the way that a model manifested itself as the work of this or that, more or less professionally trained or skilled master. In the style, the Muscovite viewers saw the hand of the painter, whereas in the model, they saw the type that had been handed down by tradition, which always underwent a process of interpretation in the moment of execution. So with those terms at play, I want to come back and bring these considerations to bear on the Clinton feast row. The panels belong to an almost complete set of 12 feast icons. They show affinities with works attributed to Skull, as I mentioned previously. They display a color palette with earthen tones of brownish yellows, river bottom greens, and olive hues, accented by blues which have become heavy and darkened over time. As often in Muscovian as well as Novgorodian painting, attention is paid to the natural landscape with fantastically constructed mountains. At the level of composition, the painter of the Nativity creates a cohesive structure by linking figural groups with zigzags of craggy stones and rocky outcrops. The mountains are offset with black lines and frosty tips, capturing the mesmerizing play of light in a desert landscape. These limn a perception of depth around a ridge or ledge. At the center of the panel, the Mother of God reclines in a crevice in front of the cave, where she was believed to have given birth and reposed with the infant Christ child. She holds her hands aloft to acknowledge the three magi who are approaching from our left. The painter employs a sparing but well-chosen cast of ornament throughout. Thus, we see pseudo-niello work on the stool and the wash basin at the bottom left, lessons in which Rus and Muscovite workshops took from the goldsmiths of the Golden Horde. Likewise, we can appreciate the gold assist delineated on the finely rendered wings of the angel at the top left. We note, too, the attention to details of garb, for instance, in the white embroidery around the collar and the belt of the very fashionably dressed shepherd on the right, and the spacing and handling of the stitch, which imitates a beaded style of Komnenian painting, which Skov masters studied through Old Novgorod models. Also, note the cuffs and the gold threaded cap worn by the youngest of the Magi, which mirrors the affected fashion of elites in Muscovy. Zooming back out, the painter's handling of color speaks to his consciousness of the discourse of the Masterskoye Pismo and awareness of models. Color and its application as pigment in the tempera medium contributed to the image's stylistic register. But as a compositional device for creating balance and cohesion, as well as its conveyance of theological content, it was associated with a well-chosen model. The painter of this icon in the whole feast set uses color in both respects. Thus, to create balance, we note how Joseph, seated on a rock below, wears garnet undergarments and the blue, now darkened outer garment. This pairing is echoed in the garb of the shepherd overhead, in the clothes worn by the wise men on the left, and by the angel at the top right. Color also creates hierarchy by identification with exclusive materials. So, just as in Byzantine art, the Mother of God wears porphyry, which in Byzantine society was associated with the imperial family. In its frequency and clustering, color affects how the eye perceives form, including its proximity to the picturable. In so doing, it can draw the eye to key figures and sections where a twist in the narrative is unfolded. For instance, note how the white flecks on the mountains are most dense at the very top. They gradually decrease and become more diffuse as the eye moves down the picture, with the most open forms in maximally fluid lines in the lowest third of the panel. Painters who belonged to Novgorod in the so-called northern schools often preferred rigid and abstracted shapes with uncanny symmetries and applications of colors if we were sort of glimpsing tiers of mountains receding into the distance. And this is a sort of play that we see on the icon at the right with the very starkly delineated forms of the mountains pushing back towards the sides of the panel. On the Pskov icon, in contrast, the more open and discursive tones and lines wiggle around figural groups and pool at the bottom of the icon, producing a sense of congealing mass. This reflects the sculpted facade of the land as a sloping plain pushes back and opens out onto the scene. The longest lines, or pisma, help configure key groupings. The painter offsets the mouth of the caves around the Mother of God and Joseph with spindly white lines, as if he were letting his brush sort of simply meander across the board. These lines pull their darkened body mass out of the black recesses behind them. Color warmth also adds to the power of the composition. So note the vertical axis that's quietly created by the use of these coral hues with the servant who is administering the first bath to Emmanuel at the bottom, and the sort of almond-shaped cushion on which the Mother of God is reclined. Color in this way helped viewers to grasp intuitively how the forms converged in a retainable impression, and so to comprehend instantaneously what the icon is about. Color, in other words, played an essential role in how the model became an image, how it appears as a particular stylistic iteration from within the grammar of line and texture. When trying to gauge the application of pigment and thus to get closer to how viewers in the 16th century would have appreciated pismo, it must be said that it's difficult to perfectly judge this painter's intended effect and success because the paint has deteriorated in certain sections. So, for instance, we notice a patina on the garments of the servant below, which appear a rust brown, which is probably due to the iron content of the paint that was used. On her shirt, we glimpse underdrawing through the lead white, as well as in the background around her outstretched left hand, which almost blends into the brown, mustardy yellow. However, we do get a feeling for how the master worked in the rather coarse white accents on the woman's cheeks. These imbue her expression with a weathered appearance. This is amplified by the threaded strands of her hair, which are sort of metallic-like, and they fall down from her cap and sort of rest on her shoulders. The painter underscores her humble station with white, not gold, trim on her skirt, and black and not gold stitch in her shirt. The unrefined application of accents in her face where we see a trace of brushstroke, is not for its own sake per se, simply as a sort of effect that calls attention to the hand, because this rough skin is also meant to contrast with the strikingly bare and creamy, brightly gold halo of Emmanuel and his flesh, his human flesh, which is what is being emphasized in this birth scene. We glimpse other ways, both formal and stylistic, of the painter's execution of the image in telltale traits in the rendering, for instance, of the stones. So here I'm showing you three of the icons sort of against the backdrop and details of their stones pulled forwards. While painters from various schools lavished a high degree of attention on ledges and escarpments, hillocks, crags, caverns, and so forth, it's extremely difficult to find exact parallels for the stones on the Clinton feast icons. They're delineated in a rudimentary fashion, with a dark underpigment, either ochre or black, topped by a quadrilateral of lead white. The white hovers indeterminately over the darker rhombus, suggesting dimensionality, although the painter hasn't actually drawn those lines along the four or three corners. Perhaps the closest analog is seen on a resurrection icon, dating to the late 16th and early 17th century. It belonged to a feast row from the Church of the New Ascension in Pskov. And here the stones are both rectilinear and triangular, and they've been fashioned in a quite similar manner. Thumbing through the recently published catalogs of the museums in Yaroslavl, Vologda, Ryazan, Rostov, Murom, Arkhangelsk, and so forth, all of which are in this new series, Old Russian Painting in the Museums of Russia, it would be really difficult to find as close of a parallel as these stones on this icon in Pskov. It seems, that is, that this is a convention of Pskov painting, perhaps more broadly Novgorod, which was still exchanging lots of masters with Pskov, and in particular, maybe even a cluster of similarly trained workshops. Now, we can extend this comparison between the two icons in a few different directions. In key respects, the icons are worlds apart, betraying, for instance, very different ways of handling the pictorial plane, for composition, color, and so forth. But that being said, the texture and the depth of porphyry and dark blue on the apostles and the Mother of God, as well as Joseph and the prophets, are quite similar. Likewise, we find an affinity in the treatment of gesture and how clothing exposes the body below. Note how Eve's supplicant hands appear from beneath her heavy mantle on the resurrection. And then compare that with the hands of Lazarus's sister, Martha, knelt before Christ on the Clinton panel. In Byzantine art, covered hands were a sign of respect, and painters and actual church hierarchs adhered to this convention. But the level of detail for the hands below the garments here is unusual. Typically, they appear more or less as an indistinct lump beneath a mantle or chiton, whereas here we can read the gestures of Eve and Martha below, imbuing their figures with a vocabulary of emotion. So note the attention on the opposable thumbs. This treatment maximizes the attention we pay to how clothes both mask and mirror the lives of their wearers. In this case, it allows the women to take a more central role in the visual narrative. On the one hand, there's a play between an outward show of modesty, the richly draped bodies, which conceals them, but on the other, their very active hearts and minds, which propels their characters into the spotlight. These similarities alone don't allow us to speak about a stylistic accord. And indeed, when we turn to things like the faces, we're clearly looking at very different approaches. The Clinton painter prefers mostly rounded, smooth, and almost enamel-like skin, with dots of white tempera on the tips of the nose and the chin. In keeping with his overall palette, the flesh tones are yellower and more earthen toned, rather than the peach, tan, and creamy browns which are approximated on the Resurrection. Overall, the Clinton painter shows a minimal interest in shadow and emotional dynamic. The faces, we might even say, are a touch flat and bloodless, even for the often subdued idioms of icon painting. In contrast, the Resurrection painter displays characters with more feeling. The flesh tones are more varied, with rose hues interspersed with striated passages of olive and yellow-orange, as well as white and gray. So notice the variations in the color on Apostle Paul's hands, which grip his footings. The mouths of his figures are variously downturned or pulled taut. His characters acknowledge one another directly, and their eyebrows sort of cue us to a turn in the conversation or a moment of interruption. There's a dynamic. The figures of the apostles in both compositions show a remarkable aptitude and deep preoccupation with the classicizing models of Paleologan art. Tellingly, these models captivated Muscovite patrons, and they were alluded to in such expressions as Constantinopolitan painting, which likewise appears in a variety of sources like chronicles and court cases. In keeping with the overall aesthetic goals of the Clinton panels, the painter is far less interested in architectonic forms than is the painter of the Resurrection. We note, for instance, Peter's dynamic stance as he leans forward in conversation. His weight is shifted onto his left leg in contrapposto as he converses with John. This pose allows him to delineate a sort of vibrant swing of the apostle's hips and to have him engage rather artfully his flowing garments, which fall down with swoops of cloth. And this is the element of the sort of dynamic drapery that is such a feature of Muscovite painting building on late Byzantine models. For instance, however, while the folded garments echo one another, the lines themselves between the two icons are quite differently drawn. So they're less textured on the Clinton panel than on the Resurrection, which are designed according to a related model. So note the tussles on the image on the right of the screen at the elbow of the apostle. The folds have been drawn in ochre, and those are overlaid with a thin black line, and then accented with white cross hatching. And this technique gives the sleeve an additional heft and weight, encasing the limb in a sort of geometric armature. And this aligns with contemporary Muscovite painting, less so what you would tend to find in Pskov and Novgorod. So stepping back, what does this tell us about the perceived chytrost or cleverness of workshops and how their pismo or style was appreciated? Well, at the broadest level, all these components reveal how the painters approached their model. That is, how their treatment of various facets of an image amounted to an interpretive take on tradition. The model was a template that was borne in mind. It need not have been a paper drawing carried in the painter's bag, although it could be that, especially in the case of novices or apprentices. Rather, it was a set of malleable conventions for designing a scene. In adopting an interpretation, painters took tremendous care with things like line segments, highlights, planes, geometrical shapes, color distribution, narrative, and body mass. These facets all contributed to the definition of the workshop style. With these reflections in mind, I want to transition in the second half of my talk to a discussion of models among patrons and workshops. A renewed engagement with models surfaces in the mid-16th century in Muscovy. It was prompted by hagiography, which itself was spurred by the canonization of dozens of new miracle workers. By the 17th century, the weight placed on models was second nature in the visual habits of Muscovite patrons. We glimpse how paper models, or obrazцы, circulated in the life of Yefrosin of Pskov. Shortly before dying in 1481, Yefrosin asked a master icon painter named Ignati to sketch his features on paper. The saint carefully explained that he should write his name above the image so that it would be recognized by later workshops. Afterwards, Ignati hid the sketch with his master drawings, or izrazi, which literally means something like tile or tablet, and may refer to this tablet. When he himself died, the drawing was found by another master at the monastery where Yefrosin had died, allowing him to devise his icon faithfully. A related story involves a model supervised by Archbishop Pimen of Novgorod. In April 1558, on the 450th anniversary of the death of Nikita of Novgorod, Ivan IV, the Terrible, ordered the saint's body to be exhumed from behind the altar of Joachim and Anna in Novgorod's St. Sophia Cathedral. In a letter, or послание, to the Tsar by Archbishop Pimen, which circulated with the saint's vita and included a detailed account of the discovery of Nikita's body, Pimen says that the saint's body was found uncorrupted. Along with two sections of the saint's garment, he forwarded the Tsar, quote, an image on paper, end quote. In the letter, Pimen writes, quote, and when you receive this gift, my lord, you may order other such likenesses to be drawn after this model on a panel. And Lord, ensure that he be drawn without a beard, with just a wisp of hair on his chin and lips, as hardly any of his hairs were gray. He, that is Nikita, was found in the grave looking just now as he did when alive, and for that reason I have sent to you this model, end quote. Both of these anecdotes reveal how paper models circulated and spread in the 16th century. They were assigned weight by hierarchs like Pimen, as well as by the saints themselves in workshops like Yefrosin and Ignati in Pskov. And collections would begin to be kept by workshops and passed down to future generations. By the mid-17th century, workshops were compiling anthologies of paper models as reference sources and instruments for instruction. Among the earliest surviving examples of paper models is the Siiski Poetry. It was compiled in the late 17th century by Abbot Nicodim of the Antonieva Siiski Monastery. On a leaf showing St. Nicholas, we see a typical version of how this type of paper drawing usually looked. It depicts the saint in a schematic outline in black ink, with ochre highlights indicating where lighter sections of the icon should appear, in other words, the highlights. These mirror the white lead accents or gold assist on the actual icon itself. The artist of this work, who was none other than Nicodim himself, depicts the garb in sparing detail, leaving blank the medallions for the cross on the saint's right sleeve, as well as the trim and fringes on his vestments on his left sleeve. However, Nicodeme does pay a great deal of attention to Nicholas's frost-tipped beard, the wrinkles in his face, the cover of his lectionary, and the blessing gesture, which of course is reversed because this is a tracing. We know that Nicodeme created this pattern because, as would become standard practice, he signed the back of the leaf, the model or obrazец of Vasily Mamontov Uvarov, which was his name in the world. Crucially, this practice associated a lead painter with the type or genus, less so with the individualized interpretation. And it's hard to overstate the importance of this development in Muscovite aesthetic thought. When style reigned supreme, it was the interpretation of the model that mattered most. Whereas when the pattern was elevated, it was the type which garnered praise. Gradually, over the centuries and still today, this tug of war between the stylistic finesse or virtuosity and a sturdy and changeless ideal plays out in the viewing and appreciation of icons. We see the transition from a definition of the painter's hand as a force of singularity to the hand as a purveyor of a trusted type in the letters of Maxime Grec. Born in Epirus, Greece, Maxime trained on Corfu. For several years, he lived in Italy and then on Mount Athos before, in 1516, he traveled to Moscow to help with translating the commented Psalter into Slavonic. In a conversation dated to 1518 with his fellow translator, Dmitry Gerasimov, in Novgorod, Maxime expresses doubt about whether painters can be trusted to follow models. He recommends that a commentary be penned to ensure full adherence to the accepted Byzantine type. The subject of his conversation involved an unconventional representation of the crucified seraph. As Maxime explains to Gerasimov, quote, "For it is superfluous to draw such images as lead those of other faiths and our simple-minded Christians into temptation. It suffices for Christians to draw and venerate the icons that the Holy Fathers instituted and ordered the councils, as well as those which the feast days instituted. But whoever would cull verses from Scripture and draw images after them would be able to invent countless numbers of icons. And there was, my lord, a great dispute about this in the time of Archbishop Gennady. The Posadniki blamed the icon painters, whereupon the great icon painter Pereplov and several other icon painters came and said, quote, 'We, my lord, draw these images after ancient workshop models, which we have studied, and they have been taken from Greek icons,' end quote. But, my lord, no one set down a text about this, and the Muscovians began to heed the icon painters and not the archbishop. Just as the soldiers who were in the boat with Paul heeded the ship captain and not Paul," end quote. In this remarkable turn of thought, the technical know-how of painters takes a backseat to their handling of religious content. The story about the painter Pereplov from Pskov suggests as much. His nickname probably comes from the verb plovets, or smelt, or fuse, referring to how workshops beautifully mixed colors to create polished, enamel-like surfaces, like on this icon of the head of John the Baptist. Periplov's style of painting would have been characterized as chytrost, or cleverness. However, for Maxime, concern with beauty could distract from an image's content. Better to focus on the image's theological worldview and set feats of showmanship aside. The story from the book of Acts is the clincher in his argument. When a storm came, the soldiers in the boat resorted to help from the sailors and the ship captain, who only know the art or skill of sailing. Whereas for Maxime, they should have resorted to the Apostle Paul, who possessed theological knowledge and could pray for their salvation. This is a remarkable claim about aesthetic judgment. In such a worldview, skill or hithros, such as I've been emphasizing, involving issues of form and visual rhetoric, is placed below divine knowledge, which is of the highest content. In later centuries, Maxime would be cited in miscellanies compiled by iconographics. His remarks on this and other images were construed as a basis for models. For instance, a letter on the Pentecost icon, written to Nicholas Bülow, was excerpted in the Bolshakov Sporting. Responding to Bülow's accusation that painters in Novgorod and elsewhere don't understand what they depict, the Catholic official put his finger on a key problem in Muscovy. That is, far from the Byzantine world, painters were carrying on in a medievalizing manner, but some may have been quite unversed in the significance of the content itself. That is, they might have just been rehearsing dead forms that even their audience didn't fully understand. Thus, Bülow argues that an answer needs to be given to their questions, and the church actually listened to him and delivered commentaries in the form of question and answer texts written about confusing iconography, such as this example on the screen, where we know that audiences were confused by the figure of the world, or cosmos, or mir, down at the very bottom. In the 19th century, amid a spirit of reform, Slavophiles such as Sergei Bolshakov and Alexander Ivanovich Uspensky began publishing pattern books to guide painters. While kindred in spirit, their actual texts were very different in design. Bolshakov issued a descriptive pattern book with commentary and verbal physiognomies of saints, whereas Uspensky issued the Stroganov pattern, which had lithographs for each day of the calendar. One copy of the original 1869 Stroganov pattern book is at the Russian History Museum. Each page displays a row of saints with a rubric designating the color and type of garb worn by the saint. The lines of the figures are comprised of the simplest of sketches. Their faces have minimal detail, with marks of emotion relatively minimal, and the gestures are somewhat generic. To an extent, these pattern books were an exercise in systematicity. Painters cataloged in painstaking detail all the saints of the Orthodox Church. Their compilers had encyclopedic ambitions, laying out each image like a specimen in a book of botany or ornithology. It was as if the saints had been discovered in the wilderness of a bygone era, wrenched from an idealized medieval past and brought into modernity. We see how Uspensky sought to mimic a printed leaflet on his lithographs. The black lines and ruddy hues replicate an icon traced with lampblack and ochre. The traced panel would have then been printed on a dampened page, which could then be pricked and pounced to reverse the image back on the panel itself. This monotype process is described in Muscovite painters' manuals from the early 17th century onwards. Old Believers played a crucial role in the circulation of printed patterns in the early modern period. Adhering to pre-Niconian ways of painting, they lauded the work of Muscovite masters, and they revered teachers like Maxime Grec, whose letters they collected. Another pattern book in Jordanville attests to their efforts. It was published by the Dinoveri, or the co-religionists, who, while keeping old belief, pursued unity with the church. It reproduced in photographs a series of 24 calendar icons, 2 for each month. Calendar icons had reappeared in Muscovy in the 16th century, having first been painted in the 12th century. An early set of calendar icons is still preserved in the nave of the monastery of St. Catherine at Mount Sinai. This image type depicted the saints for each day of the year, nestled one beside the other, in a tiered format, reading from left to right and top to bottom. Pattern books from the 17th century concocted a fictional origin for this image type. One author, writing in 1658, describes how calendar icons stem from the Menologion of Basil II. This famous 10th century manuscript is said to be based on murals that stood over the 365 altars of the Church of Hagia Sophia, which the Emperor Justinian built in Constantinople. Such fantastical genealogies imbued the model, or obrazец, with historical weight. The model, in essence, was an ancient relic handed down in schematic form. This compiler thus argues that the image should be maximally transparent. It should channel an age-old historical ideal with little subjective interpolation of a stylistic hand. In short, painters should not make themselves present on the surface, to return to that idea that I began with. Rather, they should downplay their mediating role in the transmission of a prototype. They should let the image manifest its content without a distracting interface. Now, in closing, I want to emphasize the role of models from one final angle. So far, I've been considering the model from the standpoint of its historical origin in Byzantium or an older Slavic world. But there was a sense in which the model stood out in front of the image, in the future, or rather in a continuous liturgical present. If we return to the feast row in Clinton, we can see how this plays out with color. Here, the use of lead white interrupts the somewhat muted scenery. White calls attention to the key figures in the image, who, not incidentally, were also major characters emphasized in the performance of the liturgy. Thus, note the white garments on the left with Christ Emmanuel in the Nativity icon, who is wrapped in swaddling. And in the middle, note Christ's white garments in the Transfiguration, prior to his entry into Jerusalem, where he would meet his death. And then on the right, note the white garments of Lazarus, who appears from the tomb wrapped in his shroud. Tellingly, each of these garments is given emphasis in the lection for the respective feast day. That is, the color is a model taken from the biblical text, which the painter expects to be read in front of these icons, in the church space at a future point in their lives. On the one hand, the text is a literal stratum of the image's truthfulness. However, that truth is not a past fact, but a present remembrance or performance. Thus, the faithful heard of the white swaddling of Christ Emmanuel when, quote, she, the Virgin, wrapped him in clothes and placed him in a manger, end quote. And the white clothes on Christ at Tabor when the priest read the words, quote, his face shone like the sun. His clothes became as white as the light, end quote. And the white grave clothes of Lazarus, when, as John writes, quote, the hands and feet of Lazarus were bound in grave clothes. His face was wrapped in a headcloth, end quote. Color pulls the key characters out from the surface of the iconostasis. In this sense, the model was not just a word on the page, written down long ago and preserved by a workshop. It was also a word out in front of the picture, in the mouth of the priest. The model rained down from the ceiling and echoed from the walls of the church. The image caught up with and intersected its model every time the feast was celebrated. The white form thus constituted an architectonic scaffolding in time, tied not just to a textual narrative, but to what Bakhtin would call its form of address. It added force to the image by providing it with an interlocutor, the laity, who comported themselves to the altar. In this way, the model was a directedness that engaged the centeredness of devotion. Thank you.
A couple of questions we received so far, two great ones from Douglas. So the first question, how did the Bolsheviks view the old icons after they took power? And the second question, are there icon painters in Russia now, and are they building on the old models or starting new? So two questions about the Bolsheviks and how they reacted to that, to the icons and this type of art, and what we have now in modern Russia.
Uh, so I'll have to sort of take a half pass on the first one. I mean, the question of the Bolsheviks' response to icon is many and varied, and scholars like Wendy Salmon and many others have really dealt with that question beautifully. So, in a word, it's extremely complicated. There's the culture that's rejecting religion, but at the same time, they are also preserving a lot as well. But they have very specific agendas for what they value. So that's a really complex question. I probably can't go too much into depth with it. The second question, I think, is gets in the spirit of kind of some of these pattern books and these model books, which are still being reproduced. I mean, there are translations of them into German and into English and French. So they're still being revitalized. I'd say there's, in some sense, there's a bit more kind of desire for the Muscovite models and conservatism in a sense as well than what you kind of see in the 17th century, which is really, really complicated versions. Of course, you have icon painters today that are really taking kind of radical interpretations of the traditional models, but it's kind of all over the place. And the Russian story is part of the Greek story, is part of the Bulgarian story. So there's a lot of different kind of models at play. You have Bulgarian model books and Greek model books as well. So it's evolving, I can say.
Mm-hmm. Another great question. You mentioned the vocabulary used for brush strokes is the same as the word for writing text. Is this terminology common to other types of painting, or is it unique to icons?
I mean, so with the period that I am really dealing with in this lecture, which is basically up to the time of troubles, I kind of venture into the 17th century pattern books. It's pretty stable, and they don't have strict distinctions between painters of like secular works. We know they painted them like on the walls of boyars' houses. But the language of Pismo is maximally capacious. So the same types of effects that they appreciated in icon painting, they seem to have appreciated in other media. Um, and they actually adopt similar forms across a range of media too, like for instance, illustrated chronicles. So uh, I dealt with this a little bit in other places, but the icon painter and the lay painter is actually the key distinction. It's whether or not the painter is a monk or a priest or abbot in Nicodemus' case, or a lay painter that they're most concerned about. What they actually produce, you could be an icon painter that produces secular works or a chronicle, It's really the biography of the person that matters more than the genre for those types of terms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, another question from Richard. Why do you think the maiden, the nativity icon, is dressed in white?
The servant is dressed in white, who's holding the Christ Emmanuel child for his first bath. And I think partly that's to emphasize Emmanuel's skin there, because in the first version, I mean, I don't have it up on the screen now, but uh, in the scene with the cave, he's swaddled, but of course the nativity is all about his human flesh. And so then you see the flesh, and the white background of the servant allows, I think, the fleshliness of Emmanuel's body to be emphasized. So I think it's partly to re-emphasize that figure as well.
Mm-hmm. And out from Catherine, a great presentation. You mentioned that one source said painters couldn't be trusted to depict holy images correctly, that models would ensure accuracy. Was it genuinely believed that icons painted from models were more holy or less, or did that not really influence anything?
Yeah, I mean, partly what I'm trying to do in that section of the presentation, which is part of also what I get into in the book, is that this language of Hitri is really, I think, kind of flexible and really fun, because it allows you to think about what they loved and what they also kind of feared about the painter. In a sense of awe, like the duplicity of awe. It's both wondrous, but it's also sort of terrifying or um, worrisome. And that's the same sort of duplicity that you get in a lot of other texts from the Byzantine tradition, the classical tradition. So I think it allows you to talk about icons alongside of a more kind of, let us use the word universal interest in art, is its sort of mesmerizing quality. It's an artifice. And that language of Hitri is applied to the devil, who's cunning. It's also applied to the brilliant painter, who's clever. And I think there's something about art which captivates people, but also unnerves them. So in this particular case, I think that Maxine Breck is partly who I'm talking about there, is worried about that. For one, it makes you sort of obsessed with art and wanting to collect it and spend all your time going after and getting the best icons and works of filigree or whatever. So it sort of becomes a preoccupation, but it's also about sort of the appearance of the image. And icons are, if anything, an appearance. And it's an appearance that can lead you to a higher truth, or it might sort of, what they worry about, lead you into sort of earthly considerations about physical beauty.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And there's a question for Women's Day from Kent. Is there any evidence of women, perhaps nuns, participating in any part of the production of icons? Are there any women somehow related to that process?
Yeah, it's it's something I'm really interested in. So you have scholars now who are really going back and questioning, for instance, in Byzantium, women writers, and we know of these in, for instance, Serbian literature of the 14th century, and Efrosinia Polotsk, who's a painter and a writer from the 12th century, um, as well. So we know of this in the early Slavic tradition. So there are examples. There are wonderful women metalworkers from the early Middle Ages. And actually, the Stroganov family has the best textile manufacturing of these fabulous palls and banners are produced by women-run workshops. In our upcoming exhibition, Heavenly Excess, we'll actually have a few jeweled icons with wonderful revetments that are produced by women workshops in the 19th century. And there was a recent exhibition about 5 or 6 years ago, I think, in Russia, all about women icon painters, which I have on my shelf at home and I'm going to start reading soon. But I've kept all my eyes out. We don't have a ton of written sources, but what I think is interesting is to think about the possibility, and they're surely there, and we know that they definitely come along in the later 17th, 18th century. I don't have a person I can point to right now in Russia, but you do have Greek scribes and Greek illuminators in the Eastern Mediterranean in the early 17th century. So there's a good chance that they just haven't been acknowledged yet in the 16th and 15th century.
Mm-hmm. There's another question about pigments. They were important for icon painting. And back then, where did they come from? How people made them? Were any technologies adopted from the West?
Hmm. Yes, there are pigments that are coming from the West, and you have painters' manuals that translate pigments, uh, inks, sources into Latin, Tatar, Greek, and a range of other languages. So these are pattern books we know of from Poland, Lithuania, from Muscovy, from the Balkans. Some of them are moving really fluidly between all of these areas. We know of pigments coming from as far away as modern day Sri Lanka because of the words that are used. And there's been excellent work done on pigments recently by people like Peter Schreiner in Byzantium and Georgy Parpulov and others. So it deserves to really be brought into a scientific level, and people are starting to do that on individual icons and sort of mapping out these larger geographies and locations. But the sort of scientific study of where the precise pigment, unlike, for instance, these feast icons, I don't think we know just yet. But there is a sort of nice archival basis to start really doing that concrete work. But it's very broad um,
Mhm.
as far as Europe, um, as far away as India, down to the Mediterranean.
It's probably chemistry involved as well, all these tests and everything. I'm curious, what are the most expensive pigments? You know, there are all these stories about the red one, and in icons, what was the most expensive and, I don't know, rare one?
Ah, it's a good question. I honestly can't tell you what the most expensive one is. I think you also have to think about like the availability of these things. So certainly Scoff is right smack dab against Eastern Europe, but we have cases of workshops producing something in Arkhangelsk, and to get the gold leaf they have to travel like 600 kilometers south to get the gold leaf, which is really far. So you're talking about the inherent value of the material, but just how far you have to travel to get it. So I think there's levels of value there as well. It's the material itself, but it's the fact that you're painting in Western Siberia. Um, and maybe the pigments are there, or maybe you, like in Skull, that they're using a lot more earthen pigments. It's not accidental. They look kind of brown and mustardy. That's their preference as well. So, but I don't,
Hmm.
the sort of cost value, we do have numbers, but oftentimes they're not telling you like the quantity of how much they're paying for this.
No, that makes sense. There is a very nice note from Maria, quote, not a question, but expressing my deep gratitude to Justin Wilson for such an inspiring and marvelously contextualized lecture. Even more thanks to the Russian History Museum, thank you, and the Icon Museum and Study Center.
Uh,
I'm
Thank
glad,
you.
Maria, you enjoyed the talk. There's another great question from Douglas. Where are the best collections of icons in the world and the USA? And I'll probably just narrow it to Russian icons because there are all sorts of icons.
The best collections in North America. I mean, there are extensive. Let's frame it in terms of extensive collections at the Menil, at the Timken Museum in San Diego. The Menil is in Houston. There's a wonderful collection here. There's wonderful collections at a lot of university museums like Harvard, Princeton, Yale. There's great collections at Walters Art Museum. The Bob Jones collection is extraordinary. The Chazen has wonderful icons as well in University of Wisconsin-Madison. And then there are lots of really top quality icons numbering in the, 1 to 5 or 5 to 10, um, just scattered everywhere. And on that note, I'll just sort of emphasize that one thing that we're working on, our director, Simon Marsnik, and I are really working on kind of inventorying collections for a planned exhibition in 2028 that will really bring a lot of these icons forward. Because they're sort of hiding in a lot of uh, a lot of places and aren't necessarily being shown. Sometimes they're being taught with, like the wonderful collection at Dartmouth. They're being used and being taught with, but we're hoping to kind of research them more. The answer is, you know, kind of everywhere, which is wonderful.
Yeah, I didn't even know about a couple of these collections. We should
Yes.
San Diego, and interesting, yeah.
Yes, yeah.
And the last question I'm going to ask you, Justin, I received it from one of our audience members, but he wasn't able to attend, so he just emailed me yesterday. He was curious. It's not directly related to your talk, but he was curious about the icons that people had at homes and the concept of the red corner. Could you maybe just talk a little more about this?
Yeah, maybe I can broaden it just a little bit to talk about icons in the domestic context. I mean, the examples that I was using today were mostly sort of liturgical icons. They were on iconostasis, and I sort of ended with the liturgy and sort of how that activates the icon in space. But yes, you do have a long tradition going all the way back through Byzantium to icons in domestic space, and this is something that people like um, Maria Pirani have worked on, icons in domestic sort of spaces and their ritual importance. We have in Russia sort of the icon that is the length of the child when they're born. We know that they're given in marriage. We know that they stood in red corners. We know that they, played different roles throughout the day even. So as far as the particular origin of the corner, I don't know how old that is. Again, somebody who really works on the 18th century might be able to better answer that. I can say that I don't know of any sources from the 15th or 16th century that specifically speak about corners, but you do know about triptychs being being highly valued and collected. We have examples of people owning 8, 10, 12 triptychs from all over with Armenian saints, Georgian saints, very, very eclectic. And if you think about the triptych as a form, it sort of is itself a corner. And maybe, just sort of speculating, maybe there's some relation to the use of triptychs as sort of devotional corners and the actual corner in the church, in the, the peasant's hut or other places. But I don't know of any early sources that talk about corners. But they are very, very important in history, kind of Russian, all the way through modernism and their sort of reinvention, like Milosevic, whoever else.